Hey everybody, today we are going to look at the basics of the Adobe Animate interface. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm using Animate 2020 today, and here you see I've gone ahead and booted up my program and we are on the splash screen. This screen is rather important and oftentimes overlooked. If you look at this screen, you'll notice there are a ton of options to format your animation to specific types of devices, whether that's HD video, whether that's for cellular or mobile devices, web banners, iPads, and even HTML. There are plenty of options to work with. We're going to go ahead and work in full HD right now. I'm going to go ahead and click that. And as you can see, you can do 4K, HD, or standard. We're going to stick with HD. Go ahead and click on that and open up our canvas. So at this point, we have a couple of options before we kind of get started with our interface. First, when you open it up, you'll get your document settings. You can click on more settings if you'd like. And in those more settings, you can kind of see what kind of scripts you're looking at, or if you're using any HTML or anything to that nature. So if this is something that works for you, you can go ahead and do that. If not, you can always go up to New, and that window will pop up again. And at this point, you can kind of change your frame rate. You can set your, if we want to do this for HTML canvas. For our sake, we're using this as a 2D animator. So I'm not too concerned with the platform type because we are not going to put any type of code. We're just using this as a drawing platform. So I'm going to go ahead and just create an HTML5 canvas just to show you all that you can kind of have that set for you. All right, now that you're in here, I'm going to go ahead and close that other one. You can see it says canvas. We have our screen. If we back away here and we do show all, you'll kind of see the dimensions of that 1920 by 1080 screen, which is really nice. We can turn on our ruler guides if you'd like. We can even lock the guides if you so wish as well. It's really up to you. So now that we have our interface, we have some basic windows that we can kind of play around with. We have our toolbar, which is here to the left. We'll go through these toolbars in just a second. We have our stage, in this case is called our scene, and this is where our animation is going to actually go. We have our timeline at the top, and this is kind of where we're going to lay down the individual drawings as well as the individual pictures for each one of these slots or frames to go ahead and animate our final animation. We have a play button up here. We have some things like onion skinning, which is a really cool way to preview your animation, as well as some other tools. And then we have a zoom in and out of our timeline, which can be very, very helpful, especially when you start getting a lot of pictures and animation on your screen. Over here, we have another toolbar, which has color properties. We have alignment properties, all sorts of different ones. We have motion presets. And we have our CC libraries if we choose to use those. Then in the properties panel, since we're not really highlighting a tool right now, but you'll have your tool properties and so forth. And you can always get back to these document properties as you see fit. Up here in the scene, it's really important to notice that you may have multiple scenes or stages on your animation, which I'll show you in a bit. But this is where they'll be. You can kind of navigate through them. You have if you want to edit any sort of symbols, which we'll talk about, we can center the stage, and then we can even rotate our whole canvas, which is kind of cool, especially for those of you who like to draw. We can kind of rotate our canvas to any way we wish to kind of rotate that. So kind of a neat tool that we can double click and set it back. So we have all sorts of things. We even have clip content outside. So if we draw anything that's outside this stage, it will just hide it for us. So that's the basic of your interface. Let's go ahead and get started and play around with some stuff. So let's go back to our move tool and kind of go down our selections. We have the standard selection tools. If you're familiar with any sort of Adobe program, that would be V and A, much like you would in Illustrator or Photoshop. We have our free transform selection tool, which is Q. That's going to be really imperative when we start drawing to be able to actually manipulate our drawings that we lay down. Our lasso tool, our fluid brush tool, which is Shift B. When we click on all of these tools, we get plenty of options to explore over in our kind of toolbar, and we'll play with those in a bit too. We have our normal classic brush tool, our eraser, our shape tools, so we can go ahead and draw out a specific shape and play around with the settings of that. I just hit Control Z to kind of get rid of that. We have our line tool, which, you know, pretty straightforward. A pen tool, and anytime you see the little arrow, you can kind of see that you have more options under that tool. Our text tool, which we won't really be using. Paint bucket, eyedropper. We have an asset warp tool, which we may get into later. And then the another hotkey to get to that canvas shift. And if you hold that down, you'll see there's a time scrub tool, there's a hand tool. So if you just want to move, you can do that. And the hotkey to that is H. And then if you hit, obviously, if you see here, it says Shift H next to the rotate tool. You can also rotate that canvas. Here at the bottom, we have our colors that we can use. Right now, I have my color, or my fill color, actually set to a bit transparent, which we'll talk about in a bit. And we have our stroke color. And just like any other Photoshop tool, we can kind of reverse those. We can reset those to black and white using the D key and so forth. So that's your down and dirty of your canvas. Let's go ahead and let's play around with the brush tool, because for the most part, we're going to use our Animate to do hand-drawn roughs of our animation. Now, Animate is a pretty complex program that used to be Adobe Flash. It kind of gets a bad rap. We are not using it for its Flash capabilities. Again, we are simply using it because of its ease of use for hand-drawn. If you kind of master Animate, going over to Toon Boom Harmony and other animation programs is pretty much a breeze. All right, let's go ahead and play with some of the brushes. So I'm going to actually skip the fluid brush tool for a second and go to the classic brush because that's, you know, kind of where everything started. So we have a classic brush here selected, and as you can see on layer 1, I can kind of add new layers, I can make new folders, I can show and hide and lock them. I can do a lot of cool things. If I double click on this layer, I'm going to call this rough and hit enter, and now we have a rough animation. So when I go and draw something on the screen, I want you to notice that this little circle will fill in. So I'm going to simply just draw a stroke. All right. As soon as I draw that stroke, this keyframe actually fills in. So that's telling us that there's a drawing on this piece of paper. Now, when you look at your timeline, if you want to look at it in a unique way, think of classic animation where they use paper. Each one of these squares is actually going to be a picture in a flip book. So each one of these denotes a picture in drawing. So we can really play around with this rather nicely. So once you lay that down, that's great. If I want to delete that, I can simply highlight that, hit my delete key, and you can see now that frame is empty again. So let's say I want my drawing. So let me get my pen tool here. Let me go back to my classic brush. And let's make a really bad circle. There we go. Cool. I want my drawing to be here more than one picture, right? If we have 30 frames a second, if I want that to be 30 frames, in other words, I want this drawing to be on my page for one whole second, I would simply go up here, and you can do this a couple different ways. I do this with hotkeys, but I'll show you the long way first. We can do insert. We can modify. We can go up here and play with these, or we can just right click and say insert frame. Now, if I insert a frame, it's simply going to hold that drawing for one whole second. And I'm going to hit return to play that. It's not showing much, right? But what that does is kind of hold our drawing. So you'll notice there's not a little dot here, but that just means because that picture is being held for that many frames. So that's kind of a nice way to do it. Now, if I want to draw a new picture, I simply can right click and insert a keyframe. Or I can insert a blank keyframe, which is kind of where we started in the beginning. And as you can see, that cleared my picture. Now, if I undo that and I go ahead and insert a keyframe here, it's going to keep my drawing. And what I can do now is actually use Q or the free transform tool, and I can kind of play around with this drawing. So I'm going to move this anchor point. I'm just using my mouse right now. And we're not looking for any great animation just yet. We're just looking at the interface basics. You can see it's 1 second, and this image, I want to hold this for maybe half a second, so we'll rough that. Now, instead of going up and right clicking, I'm going to actually use my F keys. So I'm going to use my F5 key. Now, those of you who are using Mac, you may need to actually push your function key down I'm even on my PC, I need to hit my function key because some of you have like brightness and contrast as well. So if I hit 5 or F5, pardon me, with my function key pressed down, I now hold that picture. So you can see now there's two pictures for roughly about a second and a half that are now working with one another. And these keyframes are all movable. You can just right click on them and move them if you want. We can start this one, you know, we can move it so now there's no pictures and it happens a little less time. These are really great. If we highlight a bunch of keys and right click, we can actually remove those frames. So Shift F5, so adding a frame is S5, Shift F5 will remove, and that will kind of change the drawing for you. So those are the basics of keyframes, and the idea is exactly that. You kind of go through, and F6 will add a keyframe. So when I'm animating, I have my like F5 and F6. I have I'm right-handed, so I have my left hand on those keys, and I simply will hit, and then if I want, you know, once I lay that keyframe down, let's say I want to make this thing kind of look like it's sinking and stretching, and then I'll hit F5 to add more frames. And you can see now I'm getting some really nice animation. Now this move doesn't make sense, but you can kind of see it here with these two. So if I hit enter here, you'll see we're kind of getting some nice movement there. And I didn't have to redraw that, because what's really great here is if I like this drawing, I can actually get my eraser tool and come in here and let me find my eraser tool. There we go. I can come in here and I can kind of erase an area, and then I can go back to my brush, and let's say like there's like a blob that comes out right there. Well, we can draw that. You know, we can draw it back in. And again, this is just our rough layer. We're going to go back over this with a nice refined brush. You can go into the program of your choice and refine it. It's up to you. You can take this into Adobe After Effects and kind of build upon it. But this is a really good way of kind of a substitute of pen and paper or pencil and paper in that old school animation way. And up here I mentioned onion skinning, and I'd be remiss not to talk about that early, but if we go ahead and hit onion skinning, you get these little bars, and what those will show you, it's kind of cool, they'll show you the previous frames that, the keyframes that you've animated. And, you know, you can turn them on and off as you see fit. You can right click on it and you can actually set the settings of it. So if you don't like the range of frames, or if you don't like a specific way it's coloring in, you can change that. But this is a really great animation tool that you don't get in you know, even in After Effects. So this is a really great thing that you can kind of animate with. So kind of cool, kind of lay those out. And again, if you want to delete your keyframes, I can hold Shift, I can grab all my keyframes, right click, simply hit Shift F5 or remove frames, and they go away. So in the brush tool, we have some options. So as you saw, I kind of just, I need to lay a keyframe down, so I'm going to hit F5 here to do so. Go back to my brush tool here. And I have some options in here. One of them is object drawing mode. So I typically like to turn that on. What that does is it keeps each individual stroke, you can see, its own object. So when I go back to the selection tool, you can see those strokes are two separate things. Otherwise, if I don't have that on, let's go back to our brush tool, and I take that off, and I draw a stroke and then a stroke. You'll notice it merges them, which is kind of cool in itself. I mean, you can see like a lot of cool possibilities to kind of get that together and merge it. So when I go to grab this now, it should just be one object that I can kind of play around with. And that's really the benefit of Flash. You know, we can go in and you can see that, you know, if we use the direct select tool or the selection tool, we can see that now we can manipulate these strokes and these shapes any way we wish. These are vector, so again, you don't really have to worry about scalability. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight my tool here, hit delete, still have that empty keyframe, and let's look at some other options. So I like to turn on, if I'm looking for that sketch look, that object drawing mode. I actually lock my fill as well. Right now my fill is set here, and you can see I've turned the opacity of the fill, or alpha and opacity are interchangeable here, to about 43. So I kind of lock that. And then if you have a tablet, which I'm hoping, it's because it's required, everyone should have a tablet for this class, I'm going to, I could use my tilt, and most importantly, I want to use my pen pressure. because that's going to give me some really cool dynamic lines. Now, the better tablet you have, right now I'm using a Surface Studio, so they're famously don't get as much pen pressure as maybe a Wacom tablet, but hopefully those of you who picked up Huon or Wacom tablets are getting some nice pen pressure out of this. So by that means if I press really lightly, you'll see I get a very thin line, and as I press down, I'm getting a very thick line, and as I lighten up, I'm getting a very light line. So very, very cool stuff, especially if you're trying to kind of get some dynamic line action within. I'm actually going to go up here and go back to my selection tool. It's a lot easier to delete things. All right, so that's one type of brush you can use. The other type of brush is the fluid brush, and the fluid brush is really, really cool because you get a lot more options. For instance, we have like a pressure stabilizer. You'll see we have the velocity of the pointer, so you can see I'm getting a lot more dynamic line without having to try so hard. You know, you can kind of push down and play and pull. And the way you kind of work these is you just test it out, depending on your abilities. You could just kind of test it out. Now, you're going to occasionally get, depending on your software updates, you're going to occasionally get little lines like that. As you saw, there's like a straight line if I pull my brush off the canvas too quickly. So, I suggest everyone gets in here and just starts drawing, draw circles, draw, right angles, draw a couple lines, figure out what your system can do. Occasionally, you're going to actually get a little bit of lag with this, depending on how fast your computer is or how up-to-date your drivers are, and that's okay. But if you know what that lag is coming in, you're going to be a lot better off. So you can see I added taper, which I absolutely love. I love a little taper on my brush. And this gives us a really, you saw right here, right, that taper that's happening. This gives us a really nice brush stroke. So we can change our max and min size. And you can see it's pulling almost like ink, which is really neat. So we can get a lot more dynamic lines. And because it's in that object drawing mode, I can kind of go over and sketch a little bit as we draw. And so really nice stuff. Play with the curve. You can have a stabilizer for those of you with a shaky hand. You can see it kind of fixes those problems for you. Again, a good kind of brush to kind of start with are these two starting points. So kind of play around with that. You can play around with the velocity of the brush. How you kind of draw is really up to you. And all of that is housed on that keyframe. So if I went up there and I just said remove frame, all of that will go away. All right. So those are really the basics of getting something on your screen. And the idea is that you may have a rough layer, you may have like a polish layer, right? You may then go ahead and put in something like secondary action, or you may even just, you may have a specific layer for color. And all these work really well with one another. You can kind of move the keyframes, you can change them. So typically what I do is I start with that rough layer, and I'll hit a delete on that, and I kind of put it in my rough animation and go from there. So if I wanted to add a keyframe, again, I'd hit F5, add a blank frame. In this case, we'll just use our standard brush tool. We don't really need anything fancy. I want to zoom out of my my canvas a little more. So I'm going to kind of go to 50% so I can see everything. And I'm going to undo that stroke, go to my brush, 10, look at all my settings, that looks good. Draw a ball. And let's add a keyframe or a frame at F5, and then let's add a keyframe at F6, but let's use that Q tool or that transform tool to now move this down. We're going to move this ball down. So this ball is going to come and hit, and we're going to add a couple frames here. So we'll hit F5, we're going to hit F6, and we're going to shrink that in and hit return. So now I'm starting to get animation, and what I can do is, if I have too many frames, which I knew I did, I'm going to go ahead and right click in here, and I'm going to remove those frames. And then now if I hit enter, now we're starting to get some cool motion. So maybe I want to add another keyframe here. So I'll hit F6 and that will kind of record this drawing, and I'm going to go and move it down a little. And I have my onion skin turned on, and that's really important to kind of understand, because onion skin is going to give you these really nice abilities to kind of get your squash and stretch and so many different things. So now you can see it's kind of squashing. I can come up here and say around this frame. You could right click or you can hit F6. Oh, I hit F5 by accident. There we go, F6. We can kind of have it come and hit here. So all of a sudden now we're animating, right? Which is a really cool process. And it's as easy as that. You know, you could go in and draw every frame. In this case, I'm kind of animating on 2s here. So I'm holding my frames every 2 frames, and we'll do that here by hitting F5. And as you can see, we have that ball drop. And at any point, if I want to change it, if I want to kind of go and adjust, want to maybe move this up, maybe this needs to be up a little bit. I want to change kind of the spacing. I can do that and just adjust it. So once I have this and I'm ready to go, what I can do is I can export this. Now, for our sake, we're going to eventually put these in After Effects and other things. But right now, if we want to export this, we can go to Export. We can export just the image. We can export a movie. So we can export, if we click that, you'll see a JPEG sequence. And SWF is also a popular format. And so we can export that kind of stuff. We can export to video or media, which is kind of neat. So if we export to video and media, we can kind of make it a QuickTime. Let's go ahead and do that. We're going to put this in a folder, hit export. So I'm just keeping this standard. It's not a very long one. And give it a second. And it will make, it's doing its process right now. It should make a folder called Untitled for us. There's Untitled 1. So that's our actual Flash object, which is good. And so there we go. So we can open this with a variety of programs. I just got this computer, so bear with me while I kind of go through. Also, we can publish. So if we go to Publish Settings, we can go into Publish Settings, and there it goes. It decided to test me there. But now there should be here, there's a movie file. So what this did was it actually opened up Windows Media Encoder. So once it's in here, it's kind of a long file type, but I'm going to go ahead and hit, it says it's done. So I'm going to go ahead and find that, double click it, and then there's our ball bounce. This is something you could upload to YouTube when you get the chance. Just as you continue to do your projects, that's where we're going to be putting most of them. So you can see it takes a few seconds, and it kind of opened another program, which was why there was a lag, but it got this out of here. So at this point, we have the ability to kind of manipulate these keyframes. We have the ability to change up the brushes and do all sorts of things. Now, Flash, you know, this is just straightforward, but Flash also has the ability to do symbols. So if I'm playing with some symbols, let's go ahead and do this on a new layer, and let's hide this layer. If I want to make a symbol, what I could simply do is I can make another canvas. So if I insert, let's do a new symbol, and we're going to do a graphic and call this line shake. And we're going to add, and as you can see, it opened like a really huge canvas. You can actually not zoom out of this. Like it's going to fill it. So I'm going to take this canvas and I'm going to draw a couple lines. I'm going to use, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to put F5, and then I'm going to put F6, and I'm going to hit delete, and I'm going to draw that, F5, F6, hit delete, then I'm going to draw that. So you can kind of see the pattern I'm going. So I'm going to hold this for, oops, I want to hit F5 there. I'm going to hit this for a few seconds, so I have this wiggly line. Let's see what this does. So if I go ahead and hit this back arrow, it's going to take me back to my scene. And as you can see, at that point, we want to make sure that we can put that symbol we put inside. So I'm going to go to my library, and you're going to see that shaky line is actually in here. Now what this does, if I go ahead and scrub this, it's just going to consistently move this shaky line. So it just repeats those keyframes, and that's what a graphic symbol does. So it's a really amazing tool, especially if you have a repetitive animation, to kind of go in and just repeat a function. And if I ever want to change that, let's say I want to go back into that symbol, I can simply get my arrow and I can double click on it. It takes me into the line shake. And let's say I want to maybe change this. So if I want to go in and make that green, and I want to make this one using my color blue, and I go back to scene 1, it kind of nests that animation. Isn't that really cool? So that's a really great way to kind of play around with this. So it's gonna work really well for you. So that is a graphic symbol, and again, a great way to repeat animations to kind of play around a little bit. Now I'm going to call this graphic symbol. Cool. So you may use these at some point. Now I'm going to make another layer, and let's go ahead and hide our graphic symbol. And let's do something similar though. Let's go ahead and make a new symbol, and we're going to make a movie clip. Now this is where it kind of gets a little bit tricky. Now I don't personally use movie clips a ton. If you have a lot of animation happening, you can, and if you have a lot of interactivity, mainly because movie clips do require a little code, which we're not going to get into. But if I went in here and I get my brush tool, so let's go back to that brush tool, and let's draw that line, nice blue line, F5, whoops, I hit F6 there, F5, and then F6, hit delete, just keep these lines blue, F5, F6, hit delete, kind of go in there again, F6, F5, there we go. So kind of just adding to our animation. Now remember the last clip, it still moves, it's still great, but watch what happens now. All right, let's go to our library. Let's insert that movie clip. Okay. When I scrub, what you'll notice is when I'm scrubbing here, and scrubbing is just the act of pulling your timeline back and forth. And let me turn off my onion skin. You'll notice it doesn't move, right? It doesn't move like the graphic symbol does. That one still moves. The movie clip will play, but only when we test our animation. So if we went ahead and hit publish right here, and we kind of published this animation, and we tested it, it's going to tell you there's a lot of like the frame numbers and JavaScript things, but you know, it's not really giving us that appearance that we want. So keep that in mind as you kind of move forward. And the way it kind of works is once this renders, you'll see those, but it will only last for those seconds that are on. So again, it's not like it's going to last for 25 seconds. So let's go ahead and export this, or we can go to our publish settings real quick. And we're in HTML5, so we're not going to get published there. We're going to go to export movie or video. There we go. We'll call this untitled 3. Remember, this is going to take a few seconds. And what's going to happen is you're going to only see really the frames. I think we ended up only having a handful of frames here, right? Yep, 6 frames of the movie clip playing. So again, graphic symbols I kind of like to use. Here we go. Just because I can see what I'm animating. We're going to see all the layers. But movie clips, you know, don't really do it for me. So it's just something to think about as you continue to build out your animation. And you can convert these back and forth from one another too. So at any point, if you want to kind of go into this symbol and play around with it, you can see up here, you can change it. You can play with the looping. If you just want it to loop once, you can make it just play once. You can add different color effects like transparencies and all sorts of good things as well. All right. Well, those are the basics of the Flash interface. I hope you guys learned something. I really encourage you to explore and not get lost in all the folders, but kind of think about the rough animations that we did to start. You know, these are imperative to kind of learning the 3D process. Starting with a rough sketch, moving on to a very fancy sketch is super important. All right, I will catch you all in the next video. Have a good